It's lovely to be with you all. And we're continuing with our little series in Acts. And a few weeks ago, we heard from Josh about the importance of community. And in fact, all over these weeks, we have thought about relationships, community relationships in one form or another, albeit discipleship, or as Martin spoke to us a few weeks ago about the Good Samaritan and the need to connect with other people that we wouldn't normally connect with. And today, we're continuing that. We're thinking about community as being a community, our mission. So there are lots of ways of doing community, aren't there? A family is a little community. And we might be involved in regular activities in the town where we have a little community around the kind of activity we do. This church is a community. There are other churches in the town that are a community that we also connect with. The town in itself is a community. So there are lots of ways of doing community because it's a natural way that God wants us to connect with each other. We're not meant to live in isolation. We're meant to live in community. It's natural. So community isn't a way of doing mission. Mission comes out of naturally being a community, because if we're naturally being a community, we will want to connect with others. So it will be a natural thing to do. Now, when we think of being part of a community here, in our church here, first thing that might spring to mind is maybe being in a team, or the particular way that we serve by using our individual gifts. And all those things are really necessary, aren't they? We couldn't actually do what we do as a community and be the community we are if people didn't do those things for us. You know, one of the things that I really love is that on a couple of occasions I've done something here and I've needed the room set out in a different way. And I just mention it to Andy, and I come in the next time, and it's like the furniture fairies have been. And the room is just perfect. You know, and I really love that. Thank you, Andy, for doing all that. Because, let's put on that's something that is unseen, isn't it? But it's great. I love the furniture fairies when they do that. But let's have a look at our first slide now. Okay, so you can see we've got a circle and community. So let's have the next bit of that, please, Luke. And there is our personal contribution to it. Now, we could have all those things. We could make all our contributions. We could have all our teams, and yet still not have the sense of being a community, because that isn't ultimately, there are important things to do, but that's not ultimately where the sense of community comes from. So could we have the last piece of that? That's our attitude. So everything starts with an attitude and works out from there. So I looked at, what's attitude? I mean, attitude is a bit airy-fairy word, really, isn't it? I mean, what does it really mean? So attitude is a favourable or unfavourable reaction to something that becomes apparent in our beliefs, thoughts, feelings, or behaviours. So, in other ways, it's the way that we respond to something internally, to an outside thing, that shows up in our behaviours, thoughts, and beliefs. Now, we might think others don't notice what our attitude is. I'm not sure that's true. I think we do. Sometimes other people are aware of it more than we are ourselves. Now, I'm sure you'll be all painfully aware that when you live with other people, attitudes can be severely tested, can't they? actually. And no more so when there are disagreements or differing views, things to work out. So the passage in Acts is probably not, I would say, one of the most exciting ones, and thank you, Costas, for reading that so well for us, because it's quite a long chunk, thank you. It's probably not the most exciting thing to hear in Acts. There are lots more exciting things, aren't there? Things that God did through the apostles, the miracles and everything that went on. It's so much more exciting. But nevertheless, this passage is really important because it's about community and how to deal with disagreement and how to include people when things are difficult on both sides. And that is really important. The disagreement is bound to happen because we're all unique individuals. We all have our own thoughts, our own experiences, the things that we think, our own perceptions. But the important thing isn't whether we disagree, because we will. It'd be really boring, actually, if everybody was the same, wouldn't it? And we would miss half that God is telling us. Because none of us would have the whole truth. So we'd miss a whole chunk. It would be such an incomplete and boring thing. So the important thing isn't that we have different views, it's how we deal with that together. Now, when I met Graham 38 years ago or something, I think it's probably fair to say, you can tell me if it isn't, but I think it's probably fair to say I was a more solid Christian than he was at that point. Is that fair? Yes. And so there was one particular thing that we had very different views over. And I was saying to him, well, you can't be a Christian and have that view. You just can't. You're going to have to change that view if you're going to be a Christian. And I absolutely, adamantly stuck to that for a big chunk of time. So guess what? It turns out, annoyingly enough, that actually you can. And I was wrong. Now, I learned two very important spiritual lessons there. And the first one was, don't be such a self-righteous pain in the neck. Because ultimately, you're only being a stumbling block to somebody else. And the second thing was, not everything is as conveniently as black and white as you would like to think it is. And sometimes we can be very uncomfortable with grey. But there is quite a lot of grey. So having things we disagree on is normal. It's normal in personal relationships. It's normal in church relationships, at work, any relationships. But disagreement is a dynamic thing. It has potential to either draw us together and create a better understanding and a deeper relationship between us, or to put a wedge in and create distance and push us apart. So unity doesn't mean having to think all the same. It means dealing with difference well. Now, I'm just going to have a look at 3 slides at the moment, if you can get those up. And here's the first one. This is about people doing teams together. I agree with much of what you're saying, mostly the brief silent parts between the words. Not a lot of listening going on there, I think. Let's have a look at the next one. You're right, there's no I in team, but there is T, so I'm nipping off for a break right now. So I wonder if that is somebody who thinks, well, I'm not winning, so I'm checking out. If I'm not going to win, check out. This is probably my favourite, the last one. If we want to succeed as a team, we need to put aside our own selfish individual interests and start doing things my way. crazy, isn't it, to think like that? It would be fine if everybody, because after all, I am right. So why wouldn't people want to do things my way? Because I'm right. So Paul and Barnabas in this passage, they are not just trying to create a team. They're trying to create a whole community. So, what must that be like? So let's have a look at what they say. So it starts with some men coming down from from Judea to Antioch. And these chaps were Jews. They were evidently Jews who were now believers in Jesus the Messiah. And the issue was, though, that they were teaching that the Gentiles who were being converted to Christianity must be circumcised. Now, circumcision for them was an absolute cornerstone of their belief. It was a cornerstone of their religious tradition. And it had come from Moses and from Abraham, where God had made an agreement that circumcision would be an outward sign of the commitment between God and his people. God would be committed to his people, and the people would give their commitment to God by following the laws that Moses laid down. So they were adamant about this. Now, this was a difficult thing for Paul and Barnabas. Paul was himself a Jew. And he says in his letter to the Philippian church, if anyone thinks he has reason to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. I was circumcised on the 8th day, the correct day, of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. He's putting himself up as the best Hebrew. In regard to the law, a Pharisee. As for zeal, persecuting the church. As for legalistic righteousness, faultless. He's saying, I'm a pretty good Jew here, the best of the best. But he had had a very dramatic experience on the road to Damascus, where Jesus revealed himself to him through a bright light, and he heard the voice of Jesus. And he knew the saving grace of God. He knew that you could never do it by the law. It was only by the saving grace of God, the righteousness that comes through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins on the cross. So by these men coming and teaching that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised, not only would that mean that the Gentiles needed to accept all the Jewish traditions, effectively becoming Jews, but it would also mean that they were saying that Jesus' death on the cross and his resurrection was not enough. You had to add to that in some way. Now, we can never add to that. There's nothing we can do to add to what Jesus has done. He did it all. So Paul and Barnabas are faced with this situation. Now, this isn't a dispute. It's called a sharp dispute, actually, in the passage. But this was not a sharp dispute about when they might have coffee before the service, after the service, or in the middle. This was the basics of salvation that they didn't agree over. So something had to be done about that. So how are they going to deal with that? Well, firstly, they have the self-discipline to pull back from the disagreement. That is really hard, isn't it? If you're in the middle of a disagreement, whether it's a personal one at home, or is it at work, or wherever it is, when you're all fired up for this disagreement, It's such a hard thing to do, to think, hang on a minute, let me take a step back and see how to deal with this well. Because we're just emotionally fired up. But that's what they do. But what is it actually that they need to deal with? Is it just a matter of the truth? Because on this particular occasion, Paul and Barnabas were on pretty solid ground that they were actually right. So is it just a matter of the truth? Well, no. This is what made it tricky. It's also a matter of the community and building community. Because Paul is building a community from the Jews and the Gentiles, both coming from very, very different traditions and places. The Jews with all their traditions, the Gentiles with all their different gods, and somehow he's trying to build a church. Now, the Jewish history is really important to the Jewish people. And they have been trying to be obedient to God as God has laid it out for them. Now, the fact that Jesus has come and provided a new way of grace doesn't mean that the Jews weren't living the best life they could for God. So how would it be for them to be suddenly told, well, everything that you've been doing for the last X amount of years is of no value? That's really difficult, isn't it, for them to hear that? Now, if we're thinking about our society today, what's happening with that? I'm all caught up. Imagine we're talking to somebody that is a non-believer, and they say to us, well, I don't have any really belief in God. I think living a good life is enough. I always pay my tax. I never fiddle my taxes. I'm good to the neighbours. I look out for people. I support charities. I never swear. I try to be a good citizen. I think that's enough. Now, we could say to them, well, the Bible says that's not enough. You know, that won't get you into heaven. You've got to accept Jesus. You've got to accept that Christ died for you. Well, it's true. Why not say it? It's not that it's not true. Or we could say to them, do you know what? I am a believer, and I think that God will be so pleased with you because he loves all those things as well. He loves that you look after the neighbours. He loves that you support the charities. He loves that you try to be a good citizen. He loves all that. And as well as that, I think he'd want you to know, don't think it all has to rest on you, because he has done everything for you. He has come by grace for you. Now, which of those approaches is likely to draw people into relationship? I think 9 times out of 10 it would be the second one, to be honest. And this is what the difficulty for Paul, because people need to be valued, don't they? They need to be shown value. He needs to value the Jews and their heritage. So Paul and Barnabas need sensitivity and wisdom in dealing with this well. They need the right attitude, the core attitude, which is the godly one. So Paul and Barnabas and some other believers were sent up to go to Jerusalem to see the leaders and the elders there and discuss the situation. So when they arrived, they had plenty of stories to tell. On the way, they'd been preaching and sharing the gospel, and so they had a lot of proof of what God had been doing in converting people to believe. But even though the group of elders and apostles heard all these lovely testimonies, there were still different views amongst that group. Some of the Pharisees again insisted there must be circumcision. The Gentiles must be circumcised and required to obey the law of Moses, the code of living that God had given to Moses. But the difficulty is when Jesus came and died on the cross for all our wrongdoing and offered us forgiveness, our being right doesn't come from anything that we could achieve here. Our rightness comes from what God has done himself. He is our righteousness because he's the only one who is perfect. So they all sat down to discuss the question again. So they're not in the business of having to deal with this fast. They're in the business of dealing with this well, and that might take a bit of time. And they had two very different points of view. So after various discussion, and you could read about that in the passage again, they came to an agreement. A solution was arrived at. It was agreed that they should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who were turning to God. Because it had been pointed out to them that actually even the Jews couldn't keep well enough to all these strict laws and traditions. So why would we want to burden anybody else with them? But this was the solution. We should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. Hang on a minute, I just thought these laws were not the thing. That's what they've been saying. So why are they putting this? I can understand the sexual immorality, because we would generally want to follow the Ten Commandments, ourselves, which now come from our hearts, not from outward legalistic things. But what about the other things? Because they're not necessary. That's everything that Paul has been saying. So I looked at lots of different commentaries about this, and I thought, what's this about then? And the general consensus seems to be that actually it's about community. It's about building a community of respect between two very different groups of people. So what the agreement is basically saying is that circumcision isn't required, so therefore they've upheld the gospel. But actually there's nothing wrong in these things that the Jews were doing in and of themselves. They're just not necessary. But actually it's a respectful part of the community to acknowledge some of their tradition. It's inclusive. So the Gentiles aren't being expected to become Jews, but neither are the Jewish people expected to give up everything that had been of importance to them. Some things were kept to acknowledge their heritage. So here, I think, in this particular passage, we have in Paul and Barnabas a masterclass in grace. Now, grace is both truth and compassion together. We can't have one or the other. And here, in how they've sorted this out, we see both truth and we see compassion. We see that people have been heard. Now, being heard is so closely linked to being loved. If people are not heard, they don't feel loved. And that's why it's crucial. And mission, we don't start mission by telling. We start mission by listening and hearing. God listens to the broken world. Jesus listens to the broken world. He still does. And we have to start by listening. So, in our time today, I wonder, what does that look like to have this message of truth with compassion in our society today? Because we are going to be in a situation where we have very different cultures, very different people, different views on all sorts of things. There are lots of testing issues, aren't there, for our society today? How are we going to mix truth with compassion to offer a gospel of grace? What would that look like for us? And what is our individual part in that? It's not always, well, very rarely, I find, easy to get that balance of truth and grace in our responses to people. And I'm bringing this down on a personal level now, not a altogether level, because actually what we feed in as an individual will impact how we are as a community. So I find it's not easy always to have that good mix. In fact, I look back at a conversation I had, not this week, last week before, reflecting on that, and I think, actually, I don't think I did a very good job, honestly, But if we have all truth, if we're somebody who veers towards the truth more, then we're more likely to interrupt the speaker, more likely to be focused on what we want to say in reply and what's important to us rather than what's important to them. And we'll be more focused on putting them right. But if we tend towards the compassion end, more likely to focus on helping the person to feel better, perhaps at the expense of the truth, rather than finding the right solution. We might avoid certain issues for fear of making things more difficult. Might be less likely to bring a challenge when a little bit of challenge, well done, might be beneficial. So I guess we vary in different situations. Sometimes we'll be pulled towards more of the compassion end, sometimes more towards the truth. But when we use truth, we always need to have compassion paired with it. Otherwise, it's harsh. So I just wanted to end there, really, and ask Luke if you could put those points up for us, and just to have a little time of reflection for you. Say, where do I go with that? Am I likely to veer more in one direction than the other? And what would it look like for me to encompass both? How would I need to change? What would I need to change in myself in order to encompass both? And I would suggest you ask other people for feedback. How do you see me? Do you see me as having a good balance of truth and compassion, or do you see I go one side or the other? It's always good to get feedback from other people, isn't it? And if somebody does ask you for feedback, be careful how you answer. Be careful it's with truth and compassion. Because this is the nitty-gritty of being community, isn't it? How we act towards one another and how we act towards the people that we would like to invite in. They won't come by just being told. They will come when they see grace, and that involves all of us.